Hello, everyone. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine. How are you doing?
Pretty well, thank you. Except for the little flub up last week. I hope I won't do any more of those, but I think that was the last little remnant of COVID brain that I had. And hopefully
Well,
that's gone now. Yeah.
I hope so too. I hope for your sake that it is. So today I actually am not telling just stories. Today we're going to delve into a question. And my question is, why do aliens abduct human beings? And I thought I knew the answers until I started really doing the research on it. And I found out there is a lot more to this subject than meets the eye. So we're going to start with the obvious. So the things that you hear about the most when you read about or watch things on television about UFOs and alien abduction is that people are abducted multiple times, usually like throughout their lifetime at different points in their lifetime, that they are abducted often from their beds or from a car, something like that. And a lot of these abductions seem to involve like a medical procedure or an examination of some sort. Others will talk about being set in a room or laid on a bed in a room, and beings coming in and observing them, or they're talked to and told a message like, you need to not fight, you need to be a more peaceful race, things like that. And those are the kinds of things that you hear the most about. You'll even hear stories about people who have implants or scars or wounds, things like that. That's exactly what you have. So I thought we would go into all the different information about it, and I found stuff I didn't even have the faintest clue was real. So the first thing I want to say is we're going to cover the idea of it being a psychological issue. And yes, there are people that I'm sure are mentally ill that believe they've been abducted by aliens that have not ever had any experiences. But the vast majority of people who are abducted by aliens and go through psychological testing through psychologists and psychiatrists have been found to be sound in mind. They have no psychological problems. They are not exhibiting any kind of deception, including passing lie detector tests. Many of them seem to be suffering from real symptoms of PTSD, which, trauma can bring on. And one of the most interesting and influential people to ever go through this process was a doctor by the name of Dr. John Mack. In the 80s and 90s, he was a Harvard psychologist, and he really came into this as a skeptic. He wanted to see what kind of mental issues were going on with these people. So he started talking to abductees. He thought they would be deluded, self-dramatizing, clearly filled with different types of mental illnesses, but he found out that that wasn't true. As he started talking and interviewing and investigating, he found that it was completely not true. He would use hypnosis and regression as one of his ways, and it was really interesting to hear him talk about it. He actually appeared on a lot of different international TV shows, and he wrote several books on the subject, coming from that perspective. As just an aside, he died in 2004, and it's interesting, it caught my attention. He was struck by a car in London, and it was right after he had made an announcement that he had some very important information about alien abduction that he was going to be working on, releasing a book about. Now, I just found it interesting because I happen to know of several other people in the paranormal field who were working with UFO stuff who have also died in very bizarre circumstances being hit by cars. So it was like, that was like the fifth one. And I was like, wow, what a coincidence. But I just wanted to get that one out of the way because that's usually the first thing people say. What are the reasons that aliens abduct humans? The first one we talk about is for science. For some reason, they are interested in our biology, and the theories on why are really interesting. They could go everywhere from they want to build a genetic link with us, doing a hybrid. And we're going to get into that in a little more detail. Or they're studying our biology, much like we catch animals in the wilderness and we tag them and we examine them and then we observe them and we are able to track them with the tags that we put on them. And that's a very common one you're going to hear a lot about. And then there's another reason, and it's also got something to do with genetics. And you'll hear a lot of these stories, mostly from women, but not all of them are from women. And that is that they are used for creating these hybrids, they're sexualized in some way, the abductee, whether it's something is placed over their body to eject or to extract the eggs or the sperm, or they literally are forced into a situation where they are having intercourse with an alien being. I was reading, one of the people I was reading about was a gentleman who said that he was taken up into this craft. He was terrified. He was in a room where there was just like a metal bed. It was just like almost like a gurney. And he said there was this gas that was exuded into the room. And when he woke up, there was an alien female on top of him and he couldn't move at all. And when she got up, she touched her stomach and smiled. And then she left the room. And he said he knew, he understood from what she was saying or, showing him that this was what they had done. They had impregnated her. And that's interesting because a lot of cases go the other way where the alien, they have a human carry the child. There's a really interesting case from France. It was a from Canada. It was a French Canadian woman who was abducted. And when she became pregnant, people didn't believe her. Now, this is interesting. Most of the stories you'll hear about this, the child is taken. So like they're 5 months pregnant, 6 months pregnant, and then all of a sudden they wake up in the middle of the night and there's like blood down their legs and they're hurting really bad and they're rushed to the hospital and they're no longer pregnant. And there's records now. They are able to do the ultrasounds and stuff. So they know the woman was pregnant. So this woman was pregnant. She gave birth to a little girl. And she kept telling the doctors that there was something different about her child. And the doctors really did. They wrote her off as ridiculous, stupid, mentally ill, all kinds of stuff. But they found out that her little girl, as her girl was growing up, that she had extraordinary physical strength. She was very super intelligent, and that she would actually, she would talk to people and she would answer their questions when they thought them. And the doctors began to, she started showing them, talk to her, just go in and sit down and think something with my daughter. And don't say a word, just think it and see if she doesn't answer your question. She's like a 7-8-year-old little girl. So a pediatrician did exactly that. He went in and he sat down and he thought of a question, what's your favorite doll? And so he was sitting there thinking it, and the little girl looked up and said, "It's not a doll. My favorite toy is my teddy bear." And he was like, "Whoa." And she said to him, because he was shocked and he was just sort of sitting there trying to work it through, and she said, "There's no reason to be afraid. It doesn't, just because I can hear you in my head doesn't make me scary." And that's what he had been thinking is, oh my God, that's terrifying.
Well, what would most people do in that situation?
Yeah, and like I said, up until that point, everybody believed that this woman was just delusional. I mean, think about it. Here she is saying she got impregnated by an alien. She gives birth to this child, and so she imbues the child with these skill sets she says the child has. And it was really difficult for her to get anybody to take her seriously. But then after this happened with the pediatrician, the child, he started testing her strength and other attributes, and she was like genius quality, brain-wise. She could lift more than most adult men. She was just a superhuman, if you will.
And where is this person now?
She lives up in Canada, and she lives a very private life. When she grew up, she pulled away from, she didn't want to be part of that whole thing, and I can understand why. It's very disruptive. She said, as the quote that I read is, she said, she was dropping out of society, basically, and she said, I don't want to be a freak show. Because, a lot of people were prodding and poking and having her on TV as a little girl, and her mother was letting her, was taking her these things, and she's just like, as an adult, she just wanted to have a private, normal life. And that's fair enough. But she still lives in Canada. Because this happened in the early 1980s, so she would be an adult woman now. And she has completely gone underground. She doesn't want anything to do with people talking about this stuff.
Interesting. I mean, that all kinds of questions come to mind. I mean, just like, well, looking at all the species that we're aware of, unless you have compatible DNA, the same number of chromosomes and things like that, you're not going to have intermixing. I mean, you're not going to have things like that. So that makes me think, okay, so if this is true, and I got to be a little bit on the fence about it, but if it's true, that means that the alien DNA is compatible with ours, which then the next logical thing I'm thinking of, okay, were we all engineered that way? Were we part of a common thread? And I'm you're smiling like you're going to go there someplace. So
in some ways I am, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So down the road, so I will kind of get to that in some ways. But yeah, and there's a lot of people who claim that they were part of these hybridization experiments, and it's really fascinating. First of all, the number of abduction reports is not going down. This is continuing on, and there's physical, like I said, physical documentation. We've gotten more ability to physically document things with our doctors, like through the ultrasounds. I don't know if anybody's seen it. I'm sure some of our people have seen, our listeners have seen the ultrasounds now. They're 3D,
Right.
the photographs and stuff like that. So it's not even a scintilla of doubt that some of these people were impregnated, and then the child is just gone, and there's no way to explain it. Much like with some of the alien abductions, where there's surgeries or there's transplant or implants, they're there. When I was working on UFOs in Pennsylvania, I remember I contacted a person who was part of an abductee group, and she was very intelligent. I drove all the way out past Pittsburgh to meet her, and she came into this little diner, and she was a lady in her 60s. She looked every bit the respectable school teacher type, and she sat down and we started chatting, and she told me that she was actually a retired principal from a school system, and that she had started a new career as a retired woman. She was cutting diamonds as a jeweler. And I don't know how one gets into that, but apparently she was fascinated with it, and she had always studied gemology and what have you. And so she took up this line of work, and she was just this nice lady that I remember sitting there thinking, she could testify in any court in the country about any kind of other crime or situation, and everybody would believe her. This is a woman who was a school teacher. She was a principal for a school system. She's given the responsibility of cutting these gems and handling thousands and thousands of dollars worth of gems a day. She's respectable in every arena. And she had this large envelope with her. And she opened up the envelope, and she said that she wanted me to read the letter that was attached and then look at the x-rays. So there was a letter there that was ostensibly from her family doctor, and the letter basically said that although he could not explain how this woman got this small pellet-sized implant in her hand, because there was no wound track or scarring. So, if I get a splinter and the skin and everything grows over it, there's still a wound track. They can still see how it got there. And it was buried in a nest of nerves between the first two fingers of the hand, deep in this nest of nerves. And it was not bothering her. It wasn't something that they were going to remove because they were concerned about it damaging her. And they're not sure why it wasn't bothering her, because it should have been. But then there was these two sets of x-rays there behind it, in which you could very clearly see this pellet about a quarter of an inch long, kind of like a little tiny capsule. And it was laying there in that nest of nerves. And she said to me, I know it sounds insane, and I don't honestly know when this happened or how this happened, but she had called them dreams. And she said that throughout her lifetime, she had these dreams of being abducted. And as she got older, they got more vivid. And that concerned her. So she read somewhere about how there's a certain type of blue light, black light kind of thing, that they use for gems, to look for flaws in gems. And that this light would can show like fingerprints on your skin and stuff. So she had this one very horrible nightmare, and she of course had that black light, blue light kind of thing, that because she used it for work, she had brought it home with her. And she climbed into the closet. She said she felt the fool, because she climbed into the closet where it was completely dark, and she sat there and she started running it over her arms, and she could see these long 3-digited fingerprints, and they had this halo around them, and they were a greenish blue, and they were like nothing else she had ever seen. And she said she pressed her fingers down on her hand or arm and looked at them, and it just left a little elongated marks, like, from the oil, that she could see, but nothing like these. And these were all over her arms and her shoulders and her chest, these 3-digited prints. And her nightmare had been that they had pinned her down and were doing medical experiments on her. And she could remember them grasping her arms and her shoulders and pushing them down onto this metal table. And she had the prints. And then within 24 hours, she began to have bruising in those areas. So those stories are, they're really interesting. And it's fascinating, because how do you explain it? And then the next phenomena that goes on, and which is part of it, is there are so many of these stories. They come out from time to time. So imagine that you're one of these women who've been abducted, impregnated, and the child has been removed. And then 8 months, 10 months, a year, 2 years later, you are then abducted a second time, and this time you're presented with a child. And this child is approximately, the age of what your child would have been had it survived. And there are many stories of these. Usually it's the small grays that are part of this scenario. And they bring this person in, mostly women, but there have been stories of men who have been presented with children that looked part alien and part human. And then they're encouraged to bond with this child, to hold the child. And they're watching intently, as if to try to understand what that bonding process looks like, and what does it do? Does that mean that these children, being half human and half alien, that they need to bond on the human side, that they have a soul and a spirit that requires nourishing emotionally, like we do with our own children? And these people will talk about it, about feeling like either a sense of, oh my God, this is my child, or a sense of revulsion, and being like pressed to cuddle and hold this child.
I don't know how I would react in a situation like that.
I honestly, I don't know either. I can't imagine. I've read descriptions, I've read stories, several such stories where the people talk about, I remember this one about a woman in particular who, she said about being presented with a little girl who was about 4 years old. She had very sparse hair, almost like a child who was in the middle of chemo. You know how their hair is just falling out, and
Mm-hmm.
and the child had very sparse hair. Her eyes were large and almond shaped, but they were blue, like this woman's eyes, instead of black, like we always hear of. And her features were kind of an amalgam, of the alien shape and the human skin. And this child, came in dressed in this very shapeless garment. And there was one particular small gray that seemed to be in charge of this child. That was the one that kept pushing the child toward her. And she said, I understood, although I never heard them say anything, but I understood instinctively that this was the child I had lost 4 years earlier, and that they needed me to show them how to love it or to give it love. And she felt pressed to do that. And she talked about, all of the emotions that were going on in her at the time. One being, oh my God, this is my child. And the next one being the fear and the revulsion. And what are they doing? And can I get her away? And 1,000 things going through her head all at one time. Can't imagine. So those are two of the reasons, probably the two most commonly said reasons. There is some people who believe that aliens come here and they're cultivating a new colony and taking people away, which would explain some of the people who just disappear. There's thousands upon thousands of people that disappear every year. And so that may be. Interestingly enough, most of the people that are taken by alien abduction, whether it's for experimentation or it's literally just taken away, you almost never hear about a person who's handicapped, physically or mentally, being abducted. It seems like they're looking for prime specimens. And it's not usually, unless it's part of a long experiment where they start as children and they go all the way through the lifetime of the person. They don't like suddenly wake up one day and decide, hey, we're just going to take that old lady down the street. It's always something where these are long-term experiments, and they start them as children, and then they go through the process. And when the person is in the prime of their life, that seems to be when they're looking at them the most closely. So, I think that's a fascinating one. At no point has anybody said anything about how they felt, if they were, they enjoyed this experience or not. It's really very confusing and very demeaning in so many ways. Then, of course, there's the belief that that maybe the aliens are actually connecting with us because their planet is dying and they're cultivating this planet, and that's why they're watching us so closely, because they don't want us to destroy this planet, because this is where they are at, or they're coming to, and they're visiting. Interestingly enough, there are stories of aliens telling people that they that just exactly that, or that they needed minerals from this planet or water from this planet, and that they come here and they take resources from this planet. Which, I have to say, we are no different. We are talking about, if we can get to Mars, there's these resources on Mars. If we can get to the moon, there's these resources on the moon. We're talking about that all the time. So if we're looking at cultivating resources on other planets, why wouldn't they?
Well, in our case, as far as we know, there are no indigenous peoples on the moon or on Mars, that we would be infringing upon their right to their own planet or satellite. Yeah.
No, I agree. As far as we know,
Mm-hmm.
but I just thought it was, fascinating. And to be honest, though, I think even if we knew there were indigenous people, we would still do it if we thought we could get away with it.
I mean,
as
that has been the way of mankind, I suppose.
has been from the beginning of time. So I can't honestly say that it would inhibit us if we thought we could pull it off, because we've done it to people all, other cultures all around the world, and other cultures have done it to our cultures, and it's just a human trait to take resources from other people. So then the next one is a kind of a really interesting one. So what if the earth is a prison made by aliens and we humans are an experiment?
Oh, now you're getting into the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Earth is a giant supercomputer, and we're
Well, I
all just
mean,
running a program. Yeah.
there are some really interesting details, things that make you think that that's a possibility. Are the humans that were born elsewhere banished here because they were too violent and non-compliant, and they were just allowed to become an experiment that has run amok over time? And one of the arguments for this is that, we are a creature that really are ill-fitted for the planet. If you look at us biologically, so we know biologically animals tend to develop in a way that makes them be able to take advantage of their environment, if you look at the animal population. But human beings, not so much. We are not able to stay underwater, and yet our planet is covered with it. We can't handle too much sun. We can't handle, we've had to learn to adapt in other ways because we can't handle the cold and the hot and the things that go on. We're just simply not built to live on this planet, and yet we do. We survive on it. But we've had to make a lot of changes in order to do that. So that's one of the arguments that's given in that thing. And I must tell you, I have no skin in the game on any of these possibilities. I just thought it was fascinating.
You're just telling the tales. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The last one is probably my favorite, just because it makes so much sense to me. That doesn't mean it's true or that I believe it. It just means that when I read it, I went, this one I can follow the train of thought with. So the idea is that, we are a colony of some sort. One of the other arguments that they use for it is that we know that the gravity of the universe, scientists have discovered that this is amazing fact that any space vehicle which tries to leave the planet, is bound by this energy that tries to literally stop us from coming off the earth. There's an actual belt of gravitational energy around the earth that they have to get through. So was that put there to kind of help inhibit us from being able to get off the planet? Possibility. And then there's this really kind of interesting quote. So back in the late 1990s, right at the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this piece of information that came out of the former Soviet Union at a meeting. Then this was fascinating to me. So it says empirical scientists from the former Soviet Union actually accidentally blurted out at a meeting that the moon was made by the ancients. Soon as it was said, the press began to try to argue that this was not true. The Soviet scientists said that they believed that the solar system is a prison and that we were here as criminals. This is what they had deduced. From this, it was speculated that most likely the moon is an aircraft made by another intelligent creature to monitor the Earth and the activities of human beings. So this was the theory they were working on. And I just thought that was fascinating.
Food for thought, but yeah.
Now, the next one's kind of grisly, I will freely admit. What if we are a food source? We've talked about cattle mutilations, and I have to tell you, there are some really scary stories of human mutilations, very much like cattle mutilations, including the coring of the eyes sockets and the anus and what have you. And these bodies have been found. There's some really interesting stories about this running from not just the United States, but all of South America. There are stories throughout They're not well known, but they are there. Then there's what's called the Lovett-Cunningham incident, where an Air Force, this is interesting, it's called Project Grudge, Report 13. There was an Air Force gentleman who was a sergeant who was working for the Air Force doing an experiment with a couple other men, also scientists. He starts to scream, and they think because they're out in the desert he got bit by a snake. So they kind of go over the top of the hill, little sand dune where they're at, and he's down there howling, just howling, and something is literally picking him up. Like we would call it a tractor beam today because of the Star Trek things, lifting him up in this beam of light, and he's gone. Several days later, his body is found about 10 miles from the abduction site, and he was found mutilated. His eyes were taken out, his rectum and all of that was removed, and with surgical precision. And this was in the early 1970s. So long before that was something we were going to hear a lot about. You know, that's right at the beginning of the cattle mutilation stuff too. That doesn't start until like 1973. So I thought it was a really interesting story because it was written up in the military, you know, there is a report on it. And now the report has been withheld, but there have been like bootlegged copies and stuff like that have come out from people who've read it and like told them what was in it. There's been a couple people who've taken photographs of some of it, stuff like that. But there's about 6 of these reports in that project report package that have not, that were just like that. So what if that is one of the things? So I thought that was really interesting. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was I'm going to do the final one here. And this started with reading a part of a post. So for those who are not aware, there is a website called Phantoms and Monsters. It's run by a gentleman by the name of Mr. Strickland, okay? Lon Strickland. And he is, and has been in the paranormal field for many, many years. I know him like generally in passing. And I was like flipping through his site just one day looking at some stuff, and he talked about the various reasons that aliens might come and abduct people. And he was actually doing a report about a professor, a college professor, who was writing a book about it and what this guy's theory was. And then he said, but he said the one claim that I'm sure people will ridicule is that I believe that abductees are related to ancient lines of hybrids. And then he says that I believe that for thousands of years, these hybrids have been identified, hunted down, and disposed of by various alien races. I also believe that the world governments have been cooperating in a systematic genocide since at least the 1950s. The description of the abductees enduring heavy invasive experimentation, and he talks about what all that would be, and the ultimate disposal in huge cylindrical shaped cylinders bolsters the theory. And then he says this, and this is what took me to the one I never thought I would find. The reason why these exterminations are taking place is not an easy one to pin down, but much of it is metaphorically described in the Book of Enoch, which the Book of Enoch is a book that supposedly was part of the Bible and was separated from it, because there were all these ancient texts that were brought together, and then I believe it was in Rome that they took a look at them, and they decided which ones would be part of the Bible and which ones would not. And the Book of Enoch didn't make the cut, but it's easily accessible. You can get it on the internet today, and it still exists, much like there's many other texts that didn't make the cut. And so the Book of Enoch has some really interesting stories. One of the things they talk about are the Watchers, which seem to parallel the Nephilim from the Bible. So for those who don't know, the Nephilim are supposed to be the offspring of angels and human women who came together, and the angels impregnated the women, and they gave birth to children who became the giants in the land. That's the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was one of the giants, one of the Nephilim. And so that would probably be the most commonly known story from the biblical time. So that got me to dig in further down. So there are people in the religious community, these are scholars, that don't actually, this doesn't actually make it to the local church pulpit, and you're not going to read about a lot of it in books or anything like that, but that they believe that, try to do this so it makes sense to everybody. So we know that in the Bible, there was this great war in heaven, and 1/3 of the angels were revolted, and they tried to help Lucifer to overtake God and take over heaven, and they were cast out of heaven. They fell down from heaven to earth. That's the story from the Bible. And in Genesis, it talks about the Nephilim, or the giants, these people that were Canaanites. So many of them were Canaanites, and how they were so much larger and stronger and very barbaric. And these were believed to be the offspring of this union. Now, this argues that what's happening is that the Nephilim, when they died, they had a soul because they were half human, but they didn't go to heaven because they're kind of a corrupt, if you will, a corrupt creation. They were not part of what the plan was. So they literally stayed on Earth. And the argument is that these aliens that we see are really the spirits of the Nephilim, and we interpret them as alien creatures. And that they really are the aliens and the Nephilim and demons are all the same thing. They simply are taking different shapes. And that the reason the aliens are fascinated with human body and human reproduction is because they yearn to know what makes us special and how our soul functions, because they don't understand it. And there are some really interesting UFO abduction cases where they talk about the aliens attempting to steal their souls. And there are some really interesting stories of this. I've actually referenced it once before in a previous podcast. Back in the 1970s, there was a alien abduction case that took place down south, and the two gentlemen it became very, very famous. And it was Pascagoula. If you look it up, it's the Pascagoula case. A young man and an older gentleman were fishing, and then they were abducted by aliens. Now, that's the official story. The police never shook the guys. To this day, the story stands. They were taken on board a ship. Experiments happened to them, and then they were not unconscious. And then when they woke up again, they were on the dock where they had been fishing. They were terrified. They were disheveled, and they got in the car. The car windows had all been, it was a brand new car. The car windows were all smashed out, and they drove to the police station because they wanted to warn the police that these terrible creatures were stealing people and doing terrible things, and like, you need to tell the military. And that's the story until about 5 years ago. The young gentleman is now an older gentleman, because like I said, this took place in the 70s, and he finally agreed to go through a hypnotic regression. During the hypnotic regression, tapes were made. He came out of these regressions without the knowledge of what he remembered under regression, because he didn't want to know. But the tapes were all given to him so that if and when he was able to listen to them emotionally, he could do so. And when he began to listen to him, this following event came about. He talked about exactly what I said: out fishing, captured by aliens, taken to ship. He's in this large glass tube, if you will, in a fluid. And he could feel, he says he could feel there's something above his head, and he could feel it sucking his spirit, his soul, out of him. And it's exactly what he said under regression. It was stealing my soul. And then in the doorway, this angel of light appears. And he said the alien that was doing this literally ran to the farthest back corner of this room he was in. And he said, I got the distinct impression it got caught. Like it shouldn't have been doing this, and this being of light caught it. So he said at that point in time, the being of light looked at the alien, and the alien kind of cringed. Then it looked at him, and he said, at that moment, I could feel my soul re-enter my body. And that was the last thing he remembered before he woke up on the dock. So, and there are other stories of this as well. So what if these fallen angels came to Earth in human form, mated with women, created these Nephilim? These Nephilim, there was no context for them to exist, and yet they suddenly do. Half human, half angel. And they're angry and they're jealous of the human body, and it may very well explain a lot of the demonic possession, because they will possess the body of a person and try to ride through life experiences with it. And I've talked briefly about possession. I haven't gone in and done an episode on that for a long time, because frankly I don't know. It's a dark thing, and some people get really upset and disturbed with how dark it is. But the truth of the matter is that demonic possession, if you will, is very, very rare. Most possession cases that actually happen are human possession, so a disembodied soul or being stealing the body of a living person and using it for some function, whether it's to feed on its energy or it's to relive life experiences. A lot of those stories exist. They're just not talked about, and I've referenced them in many other episodes over the years. But they do exist. Those are true stories. There is actually 3 or 4 books full of them that I know of, written by three different psychiatrists who have collected these stories and gone through them inch by inch. It's fascinating to read. So the last one is that the aliens are literally demonic entities that are angry with humans because we have a connection to God through that spark called the soul that they can't figure out how to use. They can't figure out how to work it, because they shouldn't exist in the record of time. And they're angry and they're jealous and they're hateful and they're trying to figure it out. And if they damage us in the process, they don't care.
No response.
I found this one very fascinating, and I really did. I know I got into a little religious stuff at the beginning of this theory, but you can't not get into it in order to make this make sense. Mm-hmm. But I didn't go heavily into, there's quotes in this chapter, this book of the Bible, and there's quotes in this one that can be used for it. I tried to not do that, but if you go back and you look at it in any depth, there are multiple documents that reference these creatures. It's just fascinating to me. I thought it was interesting.
Well, I mean, the whole topic of alien abduction, I got interested in it. Of all people, my parents had a lot of books, and one of those books was The Interrupted Journey, about Barney and Betty Hill. And right. I think I was maybe not even a teenager yet when I read that. And it was, I had always been interested in sciences, and that just fascinated me, that there could be, how could you lose that time? Where did they go? What happened? And then with the hypnotic regression, that they described what happened to them, and that was just like completely, and to use the term, alien to me, because, I was brought up in a very strict Christian religious household, so that didn't fit anywhere. But now, from what you're saying, it certainly could.
It actually could. And, first of all, Barney and Betty Hill story is an amazing story. There was really nothing anywhere out there at that time like it. So the idea that it was like something they made up or whatever. And if you read about them and you knew anything about them, they were very upright, upstanding people. They were an interracial couple at a time when there really weren't many of those. I think he worked for the post office, and she had a professional job as well. They had no children, had a couple little dogs that were kind of like their kids, gone off for vacation and came home, and this whole thing happened, interrupted their journey, as the book implies. And there were physical as well as emotional trauma to these two people. Betty Hill had a dress that was a beautiful blue dress. She actually kept the dress. I believe her niece has access to the dress to this day, and it had these weird faded patches on it, as though there and a dust all over it that they couldn't explain. Barney Hill had always carried a gun, and it was under the seat of the car when they were traveling, just in case. And it was behind his back when he woke up in the car. The car had all this damage to it, and they couldn't explain how they got home. They didn't even talk about it for days. It was very unthinkable. And then it was only a couple years later, whenever Barney was beginning to have a nervous breakdown and he couldn't explain what was going on, that they decided to go to see a psychologist, and the psychologist put him under, and that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And there's other, I mean, like for this theory, one of the things that made it make sense to me is, and I've talked about this, I have a good friend named Ryan Cavallini who does videos for like Amazon and different places. And Ryan was doing a video on exorcists and exorcisms in, I think it was northwestern PA. And at the same time, a mutual friend of ours, John Ventry, who was on Hangar 51, was heavily into MUFON and was literally the dude with the scientific explanation for everything. And if you talk to John, he would have told you aliens are from outer space and they're here to like check out humans, sort of like to understand our species and blah, 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 right? And then he began to have visitations of some sort of creature at his house that was alien. Things were going on in his home that were disrupting his home and his family life. And it was really disturbing and dark. So he and Ryan started to talk, and Ryan said, hey, other than the fact that you're saying it's aliens, a lot of this stuff sounds like what the priests talk about with demonic possession. And he's like, why don't you like have one of the priests come to your house and like do an exorcism or a house cleansing or something, right?
Right.
And it got to the point where finally, out of desperation, John agreed. And there's actually a really interesting, Ryan, if you go look up Ryan Cavallini's documentaries, there's a really interesting part of his documentary on exorcisms, which is about this. But the upshot of the story is that they did finally bring a priest in. He did do a cleansing of the property, and the alien / whatever it was, responded by fleeing from the priest and the holy words. And it left him alone after that. So like I've always been trying to connect all my little dots. So I read this and I'm like, maybe this is why. Maybe they are all the same thing. And, maybe they're the changelings. We talk about in different cultures, changelings, people stealing your children, and these beings coming out of the ground and snatching people. Maybe this is our way of interpreting something that we don't understand, but maybe that's at the end of the day, it's the Nephilim, which are the children that violated the rules, if you will, that God had set up. He had created in the angels, and he told humans, you're lesser than them, and so many ways. And yet he had this special relationship with us that he didn't have with the angels. And then when the fallen angels came to earth, they used humankind to corrupt it. And now, whether it's angelic beings or human beings, or whatever it is, now they're looking to destroy that DNA. They're looking to take it out, to set the record straight again. And maybe that's why God said that all the Canaanites had to die. That's why the great floods existed. All of that. Because he was trying to clean up the corruption of his creations.
Or the abomination of his creations. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I thought it was a fascinating theory, and I just wanted to like kind of go down through it. I haven't done an alien thing for a while, and normally I just tell you stories, but in this one instance, I thought there's just so much more to talk about, and it's in every culture you find these references. Maybe they're couched in different terms. Maybe the Book of Enoch calls the Nephilim the Watchers, and you know, in the Bible they call them the giants or the Nephilim, which means the fallen ones. That's what Nephilim means. But what, you know, what if it's that simple?
Not really simple, but, you know, simply explained. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it explains everything without having to say that there's alien races from other planets, whether there are or not. That's not my argument. But and you know, we have everything on this planet tends to want to right itself. If you destroy or damage something, it will right itself. Even human beings will try to you know, heal their genetics if possible. So maybe it's that simple. This thing that shouldn't exist is being hunted, and in retaliation, they're damaging us. Like I said, I have no skin in the game on any one of the ideas. I thought there's a lot of different things, a lot of different information. I literally came up with one that said there were 44 of them, but I thought I'd spare you all that and just kind of hit with the highlights.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had heard that there were that there were 20 odd different alien races that have, you know, visited Earth or, you know, are currently visiting Earth, and some of them are good. I mean, the Greys get the reputation of being the naughty ones. You know,
Those are the reptilians. The reptilians are really kind of terrifying.
Mm-hmm. But to read Charles Hall's Millennial Hospitality series, where he was, you know, in the Air Force as a weather observer, and in Southern Nevada, and his interaction with he called them the tall white aliens. And one of the things that they were fascinated about us is, you know, they lived like, or according to him, they lived like 700 to 800 years. And then at 300 to 400 years, they go through a growth spurt and they become the taller ones that you'd see. But evidently, if they got injured, it took them a really long time to heal. And they were fascinated how fast, I mean, like if we cut our finger or something like that, just how fast we heal.
Yeah.
And to them, that was like unheard of, you know, like a simple accident could almost mean a death sentence to them. So.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like I said, there's thousands of different types of stories, but when you start looking at them across all the different things, there's certain things that come out, like they are fascinated with our genetics for some reason. Mm-hmm. There is that small undercurrent of those stories about abductions where they're fascinated with our soul. There definitely a lot of stories about hybridization or something along those lines. Are they looking to figure out if our genetics are compatible, or are they trying to create a hybrid creature that can live here on this planet because they're not going to be able to inhabit theirs, and they know that in order to assimilate they got to look a little bit more like us? What is the rationale? There's just all this information. And then I bumped into the last theory, and I was like, so this is so different from everything else. Because when I started reading about it, I was like, how we get demons, aliens, and all of this in one little package, and Nephilim all in one little package. And then I started to pull it apart, and I was like, oh my goodness, what an interesting theory. I've never heard that one before. So when I go down a rabbit hole, I stay down there for a while.
You sure do. Yeah.
I do. I had like 98 pages of research for this episode.
Yeah, I think that would go beyond what we could put on YouTube.
So, well, I mean, and I always do that. I have to say that just that people don't know. When I write a book, if it's a 200-page book, I'll probably have 600 pages of research. I always have so much more than I need. And the reason is because if I need to sound like I know my topic, I have to really know my topic.
Sure.
So I might be writing a story about, the lady, I told you the story about the lady with the alien abduction and the lady that cuts gems. I must have interviewed her 5 times in person, when over the phone. I still bump into her at different events and stuff and sit and chat with her because I needed to know her story. And then even then I would reach out to her when I was writing it and go, okay, so this is as far as I've gotten. Make sure I have the chronology right. Take a look at this and tell me where I misunderstood. So when I get a story to the reader, I really try hard to make sure I have it accurate. And the stuff that's historically documentable, my publishers hire fact checkers and historians to document that. And I try to do the same for the podcast. So when I give you information, I try to give you enough of it you can go out and look at it yourself if you want to.
I found it fascinating that a former teacher became a gemologist and not a realtor.
Yeah, no, that was kind of funny. She's like, I was always interested in it, and I have a really good steady hand, and I was practicing doing it as an amateur, and she actually got a job working at a jewelry store, and they eventually let her become one of the gemologists cutting the gems. And like I said, if you sit down and talk with her, you would have absolutely no clue. She is this really nice, well-rounded sweetheart of a lady, and you would have no clue until she starts to tell you what happened to her.
So she still has the implant in her hand?
Yes, to this day. Because it was actually decided that since it wasn't causing her harm, even though she wanted them to go in and take it, there was the very distinct possibility that they would having to go into that nest of nerves, they could mess up her hand so much that she couldn't have fine motor skills in that hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so the doctors refused to do it because it would have been an elective. There was no real imperative that it had to be done, which drove her crazy for a while.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted it out. She wanted to know what it was. So, and I've talked to so many other people who've been have had alien abduction events in their lives. And it's fascinating to hear their stories and to hear the emotion in their voices. Like whatever it is, I don't care what you ascribe to, these human beings are suffering and struggling with what it is that's happened to them or is still happening to them. And you can hear the pain and the fear and sometimes the defeat. Nice people that, like I said, they could talk to you, they could testify in any court in this country on any other subject, and you would believe them without any reservation. Because in all the TV shows and movies, they always make the person who's lived through an alien abduction crazy. They just seem to always paint them that way. And I have to tell you, that's not been my life experience, and I've met multiple people. They're usually very reserved, very worried you're not going to take them seriously, and very cautious about telling their story because they don't want you to see them that way. So with that, I'm all done.
Okay. And yeah, I really enjoyed this episode. I mean, just the flow and different theories and everything like that. So I really hope that our guests, subscribers, and listeners also like these as well. And if you haven't subscribed already, please click the subscribe button that's down below. Click that bell and you'll get notified, and make sure you choose all. And then when we have new content, you'll be made aware of that. We have the email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. Send us your thoughts, your feedback, your ideas, questions for a potential Q&A episode. I keep plugging that, but
come on, guys, help him out now. He really wants to do this episode.
I do. And our Facebook groups, The links for those will be down below as well. And you may even be watching this through a link on the Facebook group. And if so, we thank you for joining our groups as well. And with that, I think I'm done too.
So have a good evening, everybody.